I couldn't breathe properly for 3 weeks, and that's when Robert decided I was finally weak enough to do whatever he wanted to me. My name is Aubrey Sky, but everyone around here just calls me Grandma Aubrey. I'm 72 years old, born and raised in the small town of Riverside, Tennessee, where everybody knows everybody's business, or at least they think they do. If you're watching this video, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right there and give this video a thumbs up if you can. I know I'm just an old woman sitting in her kitchen talking to a camera, but these stories need to be told. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let me take you back to 1976, when I was just 11 years old and the world seemed like a much scarier place than it does today. Our house sat on Maple Street, right in the heart of Riverside, with its white picket fence and rose bushes that my Mama Linda tended to every morning before her shift at Murphy's Diner. From the outside, we looked like any other family trying to make ends meet in small-town Tennessee. Mama worked double shifts serving coffee and pie to truckers and locals, while my stepfather Robert ran Mitchell's Auto Repair just off the main highway. Robert had married my mama when I was 8 years old, 3 years after my real daddy David died in a construction accident over in Nashville. Mama was barely 30 then, a beautiful woman with auburn hair that caught the sunlight just right when she hung laundry on the line behind our house. She had these green eyes that used to sparkle when she laughed, though I noticed she didn't laugh much after Robert moved in with his own baggage and his son Tyler from his first marriage. Tyler was 2 years older than me, 13 when this story really begins, and he had this way of looking at me that made my skin crawl even before I understood why. He had inherited his daddy's dark hair and mean streak, though he was smart enough to hide it when adults were watching. Robert himself was a big man, probably 6'2", with hands that were always stained with motor oil, and a voice that could fill up our entire house when he got to drinking, which was most nights after the shop closed. The thing about small towns is that reputation matters more than truth, and Robert had built himself quite the reputation. He was the guy you called when your car broke down on a Sunday, the man who'd give you credit when money was tight, the fellow who showed up to church every other week with his hair slicked back and his work clothes traded for a clean button-down shirt. People respected him, trusted him, invited him to neighborhood barbecues and town council meetings. What they didn't see was how he looked at me when Mama wasn't around. What they didn't hear was the way his voice changed when he called me into the living room after Tyler went to bed. What they couldn't possibly imagine was how a man could smile and wave at neighbors while planning things that would make the devil himself turn away in disgust. Mama worked the evening shift at Murphy's most nights, which meant she left the house around 4 in the afternoon and didn't come home until well past midnight. She'd kiss my forehead before she left, always smelling like the lavender perfume she saved for special occasions, and remind me to do my homework and help Robert with anything he needed around the house. Those words haunted me then, and they haunt me still. Help Robert with anything he needed. If only she had known what he thought he needed from an 11-year-old girl who was just trying to survive 6th grade and figure out why her body was starting to change in ways that confused and frightened her. The first time Robert touched me inappropriately, I was washing dishes after dinner on a Tuesday night in September. Mama had just left for work, and Tyler was upstairs supposedly doing homework, but probably reading those magazines he thought nobody knew about. Robert came up behind me at the kitchen sink, and I felt his presence before I heard his footsteps on the linoleum floor. His hands settled on my shoulders first, and he told me I was doing a good job with the dishes, that I was becoming quite the little helper around the house. Then those hands moved down my arms, and something inside me started screaming, even though I didn't make a sound. When I tried to step away, he held me tighter and whispered that I shouldn't be so jumpy, that he was just being friendly, that this was what family members did to show affection. I was 11 years old. I didn't have words for what was happening, or why it felt so wrong. All I knew was that my stepfather's touch made me feel dirty and scared. And when I tried to tell Mama about it the next morning, she was rushing to get ready for her day shift and brushed off my concerns with a distracted comment about how I needed to be more grateful that Robert was willing to take care of us. Be more grateful. Those words echoed in my head for weeks afterward, making me question whether what I was feeling was real or if I was just being ungrateful like Mama suggested. Maybe this was normal. Maybe all stepdaughters felt uncomfortable when their new fathers tried to show affection. Maybe I was the problem. The incidents escalated slowly, carefully, like Robert was testing my boundaries and my willingness to stay silent. A hand that lingered too long when he helped me with my coat. Hugs that pressed too close and lasted too long. Comments about how I was developing into a beautiful young woman, how lucky some boy would be someday to have me as his girlfriend. Each time, he'd follow up these inappropriate moments with normal stepfather behavior, helping me with math homework or fixing my bicycle chain, as if the other thing had never happened. Tyler seemed to sense what was going on, though I'm not sure he fully understood it any more than I did. He started making crude jokes about me at dinner, calling me Daddy's little princess in a tone that made Robert smile and made my stomach turn. When Mama was home, Tyler would be the perfect big brother, but when it was just the three of us, he'd watch Robert's interactions with me with this knowing smirk that suggested he was learning things no 13-year-old should learn. School became my sanctuary during those months. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that worried some of my teachers, but probably saved my sanity. Mrs. Patterson, my 6th grade teacher, was a kind woman in her 50s who had taught half the town's children over the years. She noticed when I started staying after school to help clean the classroom or reorganize the library, anything to delay going home. "Is everything all right at home, Aubrey?" she asked me one afternoon in October as I swept erasers outside behind the school building. "You seem distracted lately, and your grades are starting to slip in math." I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain that I couldn't concentrate on multiplication tables when my stepfather was finding new ways to corner me in our house, when I was spending my evenings hiding in my bedroom with a chair propped against the door, when I was pretending to be asleep until I heard Mama's car pull into the driveway each night. But how do you explain something like that to your teacher? How do you find words for feelings and experiences that don't make sense even to yourself? Everything's fine, Mrs. Patterson. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I just like helping out around school. She looked at me with those wise eyes that had seen countless children over the years, and I think she knew I was lying. But in 1976, in small-town Tennessee, there weren't protocols for these situations. There weren't mandatory reporting laws or trained counselors in every school. There were just well-meaning adults who suspected something might be wrong but didn't know how to help. October turned into November, and the situation at home continued to deteriorate. Robert had started coming into my room at night, always with some excuse about checking to make sure I'd turned off my reading lamp or wanting to discuss my report card or needing to retrieve something from my closet. These visits became more frequent and more invasive, though he was always careful not to go too far, not to leave evidence, not to do anything that couldn't be explained away if Mama happened to come home early. The psychological torment was almost worse than the physical violations. Robert had a way of making me feel complicit in what was happening, as if I was somehow encouraging his behavior or asking for his attention. He'd tell me how mature I was, for my age, how different I was from other girls my age, how special our relationship was becoming. Then he'd remind me how much Mama depended on him, how devastated she'd be if anything happened to break up our family, how nobody would believe a child's word against a respected member of the community. That last part wasn't a threat. It was a promise, and we both knew it. By December, I had developed a constant stomach ache that Mama attributed to growing pains and school stress. I was having trouble sleeping, which made it even harder to concentrate. During the day, My appetite disappeared, and I started losing weight that my already small frame couldn't afford to lose. When concerned neighbors asked Mama how I was doing, she'd joke that I was going through a phase, that all girls my age got a little moody and difficult. If only she had looked closer. If only she had asked the right questions. If only she had trusted her instincts as a mother instead of her desperation to keep our family together. The week before Christmas, everything changed in ways I never could have anticipated. I woke up on a Monday morning feeling worse than usual, with a fever that made my skin burn and chills that left me shaking under 3 blankets. Mama took my temperature and found it was nearly 102 degrees, high enough to keep me home from school, but not high enough in her mind to warrant a trip to the doctor. "You probably just caught that flu that's been going around," she said, bringing me a glass of orange juice and 2 aspirin. "Stay in bed today, and I'll check on you when I get home from work." What Mama didn't know, what none of us knew, was that I hadn't caught a simple flu. I had developed what the doctors would later identify as pneumonia, a serious infection that was slowly filling my lungs with fluid and making it increasingly difficult for me to breathe properly. But in 1976, without the medical knowledge we have today, a fever and fatigue looked like a common childhood illness that would resolve itself with rest and fluids. Robert stayed home from the shop that Monday, claiming he needed to catch up on paperwork and fix a problem with our furnace. Tyler was at school, and Mama was at the diner, which meant I was alone in the house with my stepfather while I was too sick to run, too weak to fight back, and too feverish to think clearly about what was happening. That was the day Robert decided I was finally vulnerable enough for him to take what he'd been wanting since the day he moved into our house. That was the day my childhood ended, and my real nightmare began. The fever made everything feel like I was living inside a thick fog. My head pounded with each heartbeat, and my chest felt heavy, like someone had placed a stack of books on top of my ribs. I could hear Robert moving around downstairs, his boots creaking on the old wooden floors as he went from room to room, supposedly working on that furnace he'd mentioned to Mama. But the furnace was working just fine. I knew this. Because our house was warm, maybe too warm for someone burning up with fever, what Robert was really doing was checking the windows, making sure the curtains were drawn tight, ensuring that our nosy neighbor Mrs. Henderson couldn't see into our living room from her kitchen window next door. Around noon, I heard his footsteps on the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, the way he walked when he had something planned. My bedroom door was closed, and I remember hoping he would just keep walking to his and Mama's room at the end of the hall. Instead, those footsteps stopped right outside my door. "Aubrey, honey, are you awake?" His voice was different somehow, softer than usual but with an undercurrent that made my skin crawl even through the fever. "I'm coming in to check on you." I wanted to tell him I was sleeping, that he should leave me alone, but my throat was so dry and sore that speaking felt like swallowing broken glass. The door opened slowly, and Robert stepped into my room carrying a glass of what looked like orange juice and a small white pill. "The doctor said you should take this if your fever gets worse," he lied smoothly, setting the glass on my nightstand. "It'll help you feel better faster." Even in my feverish state, I knew Robert hadn't talked to any doctor. Mama had decided that morning that my illness wasn't serious enough to warrant medical attention, and Robert had agreed with her assessment. But I was too weak to argue, too sick to question why he suddenly had medicine that Mama hadn't given him. I tried to sit up to take the pill, but the room spun violently, and I fell back against my pillows with a weak whimper. Robert immediately moved closer to my bed, his large frame blocking out most of the light from my bedroom window. "Here, let me help you with that," he said, sliding his arm under my shoulders to lift me up. "You're burning up, sweetheart. This medicine will bring that fever right down." His hands were warm against my skin, but not in a comforting way. There was something predatory about his touch, something that made every instinct I had scream warnings, even though my body was too weak to respond. He held the pill to my lips and tipped the glass so I could swallow it with the orange juice, which tasted strange, bitter in a way that orange juice never should. "That's a good girl," Robert murmured, helping me settle back against my pillows. "Now you just rest and let that medicine do its work." He didn't leave my room immediately like he usually did after checking on me. Instead, he sat down on the edge of my bed, his weight making the mattress dip toward him. Through my fever and the growing drowsiness that was making my eyelids feel impossibly heavy, I could see him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. "You know, Aubrey," he said quietly, reaching out to brush a strand of sweaty hair away from my forehead, "you're growing up to be such a beautiful young lady, just like your mama was at your age." His fingers lingered on my face longer than they should have, tracing along my cheek and down to my neck. I wanted to pull away, but that strange drowsiness was spreading through my body like warm honey, making my limbs feel disconnected from my brain. "I bet the boys at school have started noticing you, haven't they?" Robert continued, his voice taking on that familiar tone that always made me uncomfortable. "Have any of them tried to kiss you yet?" I shook my head weakly, not because I wanted to answer his question, but because I was trying to clear the fog that seemed to be settling over my thoughts. Something was very wrong, but I couldn't quite grasp what it was. The medicine he'd given me was supposed to help with my fever, but instead of feeling better, I was feeling strange in ways I couldn't understand. "Well, that's probably for the best," Robert said, his hand now resting on my shoulder, just above where my nightgown began. "Boys your age don't know how to treat a special girl like you? They're too young, too inexperienced to appreciate what they'd be getting." His hand moved lower, and every alarm bell in my head started ringing even through the drugged haze that was clouding my judgment. This wasn't medical care. This wasn't a concerned stepfather checking on his sick stepdaughter. This was something else entirely, something dark and wrong that I'd been dreading for months. "Robert," I whispered, trying to push his hand away, but my arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. "I don't feel good. I think I need Mama. Mama's at work, sweetheart, and she won't be home for hours. It's just you and me, and I'm going to take real good care of you while you're sick." The way he said those words made my blood run cold, despite the fever burning through my veins. I tried to sit up, tried to move away from him, but whatever he'd put in that orange juice was making my body refused to obey my commands. My vision was getting blurry around the edges, and sounds seemed to be coming from very far away. "What did you give me?" I managed to ask, though the words came out slurred and barely audible. "Just something to help you relax," Robert replied, and now both of his hands were on me, moving in ways that made me want to scream but couldn't find the breath. "You've been so tense lately, so jumpy whenever I try to show you affection. This will help you understand that I only want what's best for you." I tried to fight back, tried to call out for help, but my voice was barely a whisper and my movements were clumsy and ineffective. Robert was a big man, probably weighing close to 200 pounds, and I was a sick 11-year-old girl who couldn't have weighed more than 75 pounds soaking wet. Even at full strength, I wouldn't have been able to stop him. In my current condition, drugged and feverish, I was completely helpless. The next hour was the longest of my life up to that point. Robert did things to me that I didn't have names for. Things that hurt in ways I'd never imagined possible. Things that made me understand why I'd always felt so afraid when he looked at me with those hungry eyes. He was careful not to leave obvious marks, careful not to do anything that couldn't be explained away as symptoms of my illness. But the damage he inflicted went far deeper than anything visible on the surface. Throughout the assault, he kept talking to me in that soft, almost gentle voice, telling me how special I was, how this was normal between stepfathers and stepdaughters, how much Mama would be hurt if she ever found out about our special relationship. He made it clear that this wasn't a one-time event, that this was just the beginning of a new dynamic in our household. When he was finally finished, I was barely conscious. The combination of the fever, whatever drug he'd given me, and the trauma, of what had just happened left me feeling like I was floating somewhere outside my own body. Robert cleaned me up with a washcloth from my bathroom, changed my nightgown into a fresh one, and arranged me in my bed like nothing had happened. "You just sleep now, sweetheart," he said, kissing my forehead in a mockery of paternal affection. "When you wake up, you'll feel much better. And remember, this is our special secret. Mama has enough to worry about without us adding to her stress." He left my room, closing the door quietly behind him, and I heard him go back downstairs to resume his normal activities. Within minutes, I could hear the sound of the television in the living room, some afternoon talk show that Robert liked to watch during his lunch breaks. To anyone looking from the outside, he was just a caring stepfather who had stayed home to look after his sick stepdaughter. I lay in my bed for the rest of the afternoon, drifting in and out of consciousness, my fever climbing higher as my body tried to fight off both the infection in my lungs and the trauma of what Robert had done to me. The pneumonia was getting worse, though none of us knew that's what it was. My breathing became more labored, and there were moments when I genuinely thought I might die right there in my childhood bedroom. Maybe dying would have been easier than living with what had just happened to me. When Tyler came home from school around 3:30, I heard him talking to Robert downstairs. They were discussing my condition, Tyler asking if I was feeling any better, Robert explaining that I'd been sleeping most of the day but seemed to be improving. The casual normalcy of their conversation felt surreal after what had happened just hours earlier. Around 4 o'clock, just before Mama's shift started at the diner, she called to check on me. I could hear Robert talking to her on the kitchen phone, his voice full of concern and reassurance. "She's been sleeping most of the day, Linda. I gave her some medicine around noon, and her fever seemed to break a little bit after that. I think she just needs rest and fluids. You don't need to worry about coming home early." His ability to lie so smoothly, so convincingly, terrified me almost as much as what he'd done. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had acted impulsively or lost control. This was calculated, planned, executed with the precision of someone who had thought through every possible consequence and prepared for every contingency. When Mama got home that night around 12:30, she came straight to my room to check on me. I was awake by then, though I pretended to be asleep because I couldn't bear the thought of talking to anyone about anything. She felt my forehead with the back of her hand and seemed satisfied that my fever had come down somewhat. "Robert says you've been sleeping all day," she whispered, adjusting my blankets and smoothing my hair. "That's good, baby. Sleep is the best medicine for what you've got." If only she had known what I really had. If only she had looked closer and seen the signs of what Robert had done. If only she had trusted her maternal instincts instead of her husband's reassurances. The next morning, Tuesday, my condition was noticeably worse. The fever had returned with a vengeance, and my breathing was so labored that even Mama couldn't ignore it anymore. I was making a wheezing sound with each breath, and my lips had taken on a bluish tint that scared her enough to call Dr. Morrison's office. Dr. Morrison was the only doctor in Riverside, an elderly man who had been practicing medicine since before I was born. His office was in a converted house on Main Street, just a few blocks from Robert's auto repair shop. Mama made an appointment for that afternoon, after her morning shift at the diner ended. Robert volunteered to drive us to the appointment, playing the role of the concerned stepfather perfectly. He helped me to the car, wrapped me in one of Mama's quilts, and spoke in worried tones about how my condition seemed to be getting worse, instead of better. During the car ride, I sat in the back seat between Mama and the passenger door, as far away from Robert as I could manage. Every time he looked at me in the rearview mirror, I felt that same sick feeling in my stomach that I'd been carrying since the day before. He wasn't looking at me like a stepfather concerned about his sick stepdaughter. He was looking at me like he owned me now, like what had happened in my bedroom had established some kind of claim over my body and my life. Dr. Morrison's examination was thorough and concerning. He listened to my chest with his stethoscope. For a long time, his weathered face growing more serious with each passing minute. He took my temperature, which was hovering around 103 degrees, and examined my throat and ears with the kind of intensity that told me something was seriously wrong. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said to Mama, using Robert's last name even though Mama had never legally changed hers. "This child has pneumonia. Her lungs are significantly congested, and her oxygen levels are lower than I'd like to see." "Pneumonia?" Mama's voice was sharp with worry, but I thought it was just the flu. "She's been sick for 2 days, but Robert said her fever was breaking yesterday." Dr. Morrison glanced at Robert with a neutral expression, then returned his attention to Mama. "Pneumonia can develop quickly, especially in children. The symptoms often start out looking like a common cold or flu. How long has she been having trouble breathing?" Mama looked confused, then concerned. "Trouble breathing?" "I haven't noticed any trouble breathing. She's been wheezing since yesterday morning," Robert interjected smoothly. "I mentioned it to you before you left for work, remember? You said it was probably just congestion from her cold." It was a lie, of course. Robert hadn't mentioned any wheezing to Mama because there hadn't been any wheezing when she left for work the day before. The breathing problems had started after. Robert's assault, whether from the stress and trauma or from the progression of the pneumonia, I couldn't be sure. Dr. Morrison looked at me with kind but serious eyes. "Aubrey, honey, I need you to stay in the hospital for a few days so we can give you medicine to help your lungs get better. Your mama and stepdaddy can visit you every day, but you need to be where we can watch you closely." The thought of staying in the hospital should have scared me. I was 11 years old, and I'd never spent a night away from home except for sleepovers at friends' houses. But instead of fear, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. In the hospital, Robert couldn't get to me. In the hospital, there would be nurses and doctors around all the time. In the hospital, I would be safe from whatever he was planning to do to me next. The admission process took several hours, during which my breathing continued to worsen. By the time they got me settled into a bed in the children's ward, I was requiring supplemental oxygen through a nasal cannula. The nurses were efficient and kind, taking my vital signs every few hours and administering antibiotics through an IV line they'd inserted into my small arm. Mama stayed with me until visiting hours ended at 8 o'clock that evening. She held my hand and read to me from a book of fairy tales she'd brought from home, her voice soft and soothing in a way that reminded me of better times before Robert had entered our lives. Robert stood at the foot of my bed during most of their visit, making appropriate concerned comments, but mostly just watching me with those predatory eyes that made my skin crawl even through the haze of medication and illness. When the nurses announced that visiting hours were over, he approached my bedside and leaned down as if to kiss my forehead goodnight. "Get better soon, sweetheart," he whispered, his lips close to my ear so Mama couldn't hear his next words. "Because, when you come home, we're going to pick up right where we left off." The threat was clear, and the promise in his voice made me want to pull the blanket over my head and disappear completely. But I was safe for now, surrounded by medical professionals who were focused on helping me recover from the pneumonia that was slowly stealing my ability to breathe. What I didn't know was that my illness was about to get much worse before it got better, and that Robert's patience had limits that I was about to discover in the most terrifying way possible. The hospital was supposed to be my refuge, but by the third day, I realized that even there, Robert could reach me in ways I hadn't anticipated. My pneumonia had worsened dramatically overnight, and the doctors were talking in hushed tones about transferring me to the Children's Hospital in Nashville if my condition didn't improve soon. My oxygen levels kept dropping despite the treatments, and I was now wearing a full face mask instead of the simple nasal cannula they'd started with. Every breath was a struggle, like trying to suck air through a straw while someone pressed down on my chest. The antibiotics weren't working as quickly as Dr. Morrison had hoped, and there was talk of needing more aggressive interventions. Mama was beside herself with worry. She'd used up all her sick days at the diner and was now missing shifts she couldn't afford to miss. But she refused to leave my side for more than a few hours at a time. She'd pulled a chair up next to my bed and was reading to me from that same book of fairy tales, though her voice kept cracking with emotion whenever she looked at the monitors showing my vital signs. Robert visited every day after closing the auto shop, always bringing flowers or stuffed animals that he claimed were from concerned neighbors and customers. The nursing staff thought he was wonderful, this devoted stepfather who was so worried about his sick daughter. They had no way of knowing that his presence in my room made my heart rate spike in ways that had nothing to do with my medical condition. On Thursday afternoon, something happened that changed everything. Dr. Morrison came into my room wearing an expression I'd never seen before, followed by a younger doctor I didn't recognize and a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson from the Department of Children's Services. My blood ran cold despite the fever still raging through my body. I knew enough about the world to understand that when someone from Children's Services showed up at a hospital, it usually meant trouble for families. Mama's face went white as she stood up from her chair, instinctively moving closer to my bed as if to protect me from whatever was coming. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Morrison began, his voice gentle but serious. "We need to discuss some concerns that have come up regarding Aubrey's condition." "What kind of concerns?" Mama's voice was sharp with fear and defensiveness. "She has pneumonia. You said so yourself. What other concerns could there be?" The younger doctor, who introduced himself as Dr. Sanders, stepped forward with a folder in his hands. "During our examination yesterday, we noticed some physical findings that are concerning to us. We'd like to ask you and your husband some questions about Aubrey's recent medical history." Robert shifted uncomfortably near the window, but his voice remained calm and controlled when he spoke. "Of course, doctor. We want to do whatever's best for Aubrey. What kind of findings are you talking about?" Mrs. Patterson opened her own folder and consulted some notes before responding. "There are some injuries that appear to be inconsistent with pneumonia or any other illness Aubrey might have contracted. We're required by law to investigate when we see certain types of physical evidence in children." I felt like I was going to vomit, and not from the pneumonia. Through my oxygen mask, I tried to speak, to tell them not to pursue this line of questioning, but my voice was too weak and my breathing too labored for anyone to understand what I was trying to say. "What kind of injuries?" Mama demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Nobody told me about any injuries. I've been here every day, and nobody said anything about injuries." Dr. Sanders cleared his throat and glanced at Robert before continuing. "There are signs of recent trauma to Aubrey's genital area that are consistent with sexual assault. Given her age and the severity of the findings, we're required to report this to the appropriate authorities and conduct a full investigation." The room went dead silent, except for the sound of my labored breathing and the steady beeping of the monitors. Mama's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, horror, and then something that looked like terrible understanding. "That's impossible," Robert said, his voice steady but with an undertone of anger that I recognized from home. "Aubrey has been sick with pneumonia. She's been in bed for days. Where would these alleged injuries have come from?" Mrs. Patterson consulted her notes again. "The medical evidence suggests the trauma occurred within the last week, possibly while Aubrey was already ill. Dr. Sanders, would you like to explain your findings in more detail?" Through my oxygen mask, I was trying desperately to communicate something, anything, to let them know that pursuing this investigation would only make things worse for me and for Mama. But my illness had progressed to the point where I could barely stay conscious for more than a few minutes at a time, and the medications they were giving me for pain and anxiety made it impossible to think clearly. Mama was staring at Robert with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the look of a wife defending her husband against false accusations. It was the look of a mother who was starting to piece together things she'd been trying not to. "See?" "Robert," she said quietly, her voice deadly calm in a way that scared me more than her earlier panic. "Where were you Monday afternoon when I was at work?" "I was home with Aubrey, taking care of her while she was sick. You know that, Linda. I stayed home specifically to make sure she was okay while you were working. And Tuesday morning, before, we took her to the doctor. Also home with Aubrey. She was getting worse, and I was monitoring her condition. I'm the one who told you we needed to get her to Dr. Morrison. Mrs. Patterson was taking notes throughout this exchange, her pen moving quickly across her legal pad. Mr. Mitchell, she said, we're going to need to ask you to step out of the room while we continue this conversation with Mrs. Sky. Mama's maiden name. Someone had done their homework and discovered that Mama had never legally changed her name when she married Robert. It was a small detail, but it felt significant in that moment, like a tiny crack in the facade that Robert had built around our family. I don't think that's necessary, Robert replied, his voice taking on that edge of authority that I knew meant. He was getting angry. I'm Aubrey's stepfather, and I have every right to be involved in discussions about her medical care. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his elderly frame somehow managing to project authority despite his small stature. Mr. Mitchell, this is no longer just about medical care. This is now a legal investigation, and we need to follow proper protocols. Please step outside with Officer Johnson. That's when I noticed the police officer standing quietly by the door. He was a big man in a brown uniform, probably in his 30s, with kind eyes, but a serious expression that suggested he'd seen situations like this before. When had he arrived? How long had he been standing there listening to this conversation? Robert's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something in his face that I'd only glimpsed a few times before. Pure, cold rage. Not the hot anger of someone who'd been falsely accused, but the calculating fury of someone whose carefully laid plans were being disrupted. This is ridiculous, he said, but he was already moving toward the door. I'll be right outside if you need me, Linda. Don't. Let them put ideas in your head that aren't based on facts. After Robert left with the police officer, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. Mrs. Patterson pulled her chair closer to my bed, and Dr. Sanders adjusted my oxygen mask to make sure I was getting enough airflow. Mrs. Sky, Mrs. Patterson, began, her voice much gentler now that Robert was gone. I need you to understand that we're not here to break up your family or cause problems. We're here because the medical evidence suggests that Aubrey has been sexually assaulted, and our job is to make sure she's safe. Mama's hands were shaking as she reached for mine, careful not to disturb the IV lines running into my arm. Baby, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Did Robert hurt you? Did he do something to you while I was at work? I wanted to answer her. I wanted to tell her everything that had been happening for months, everything that had culminated in that horrible Monday afternoon when I was too sick to fight back, but the oxygen mask made it impossible to speak clearly, and I was so weak from the pneumonia that even nodding my head felt like an enormous effort. Dr. Sanders noticed my distress and made an adjustment to my medication. Aubrey, he said softly, you don't need to try to talk right now. Your job is to focus on getting better, but I want you to know that you're safe here, and we're going to make sure you stay safe. Mrs. Patterson turned back to Mama with her professional but compassionate demeanor. Mrs. Sky, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your husband's behavior toward Aubrey. Have you noticed any changes in their relationship recently? Any behavior that seemed inappropriate or made you uncomfortable? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I could see Mama's internal struggle playing out across her face. Part of her wanted to defend Robert, to maintain the illusion of the happy family we'd all been pretending to be. But another part of her, the mother part, was starting to acknowledge things she'd been pushing down for months. There were some things, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Things I told myself were normal, or that I was imagining. He was always very affectionate with Aubrey, more so than I expected from a stepfather. And Aubrey had been acting differently lately, more withdrawn, more afraid. Mrs. Patterson was taking careful notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that helped Mama remember specific incidents and behaviors she'd dismissed at the time. The picture that emerged was one of a predator who had been grooming his victim for months. carefully escalating his behavior while maintaining plausible deniability. "What about Monday, when Aubrey first got sick?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "You said Robert stayed home from work to take care of her?" "Yes," Mama replied, and I could see the terrible realization dawning in her eyes. "He said he needed to catch up on paperwork and fix the furnace, but the furnace was working fine. And when I got home that night, Aubrey seemed different. Not just sick different, but traumatized different." Dr. Morrison had been listening to this conversation while monitoring my vital signs, and he now spoke up with the authority of someone who had seen too much in his decades of practice. "Mrs. Sky, based on the medical evidence and what you're telling us, I believe your daughter was sexually assaulted while she was ill and unable to defend herself. The trauma to her body is consistent with forced penetration by an adult male." The clinical language couldn't soften the brutal reality of what he was describing. Mama let out a sound that was part sob, part scream, covering her mouth with her hands as if she could somehow take back the knowledge she'd just gained. "My God," she whispered. "My poor baby. How could I not have known? How could I have let this happen to her?" Mrs. Patterson reached across my bed to touch Mama's arm. "Mrs. Sky, this is not your fault. Perpetrators of this type of abuse are often very skilled at hiding their behavior and manipulating situations to avoid detection. The important thing now is that we take steps to protect Aubrey and make sure this doesn't happen again." Through my oxygen mask, I was trying to process the conversation happening around me. Part of me felt relief that the truth was finally coming out, that adults were finally taking seriously the horror I'd been living through. But another part of me was terrified about what would happen next. Robert had made it clear that there would be consequences if anyone found out about our special relationship, and I had no doubt he would find ways to retaliate even from police custody. Dr. Sanders checked my monitors again and frowned at the readings. "Her stress levels are spiking, which isn't good for her recovery. Mrs. Sky, I think we need to continue this conversation outside so Aubrey can rest." But before they could leave, Mama leaned down close to my ear, her voice thick with tears and regret. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you. I'm going to make sure he never hurts you again. I promise." It was the first time in months that I felt like Mama was really seeing me, really understanding what I'd been going through. But it was also terrifying because I knew Robert wasn't going to accept this situation quietly. He'd spent too much time building his reputation in this community, invested too much energy in controlling our family, to simply surrender without a fight. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Police officers came and went, taking statements from Mama and hospital staff. Mrs. Patterson spent a long time on the phone with various officials, arranging emergency custody orders and discussing placement options. Dr. Morrison consulted with specialists in Nashville about my medical condition, which was still critical enough to prevent any immediate transfer to a different facility. Through it all, I drifted in and out of consciousness, my body fighting both the pneumonia that was trying to kill me and the psychological trauma that was threatening to destroy what was left of my childhood innocence. The medications they were giving me for pain and anxiety created a strange, dreamlike state where I could hear conversations but couldn't always distinguish between what was real and what my fevered brain was imagining. Around 8 o'clock that evening, just as visiting hours were ending, Officer Johnson came into my room with news that would change everything. "Mrs. Sky," he said to Mama, "I need to inform you that we've arrested Robert Mitchell on charges of child sexual abuse. He's being held without bail pending a court hearing." Mama's relief was visible, but so was her fear. "What happens now?" she asked. "Where do we go from here?" Our whole life was built around Robert and his income from the shop. Mrs. Patterson had apparently been working on these logistics all afternoon. "We've arranged for emergency financial assistance through the state, and there are organizations that specialize in helping families in situations like this. The most important thing right now is making sure Aubrey is safe and gets the medical care she needs." But even as the adults around me worked to build a safety net, I could feel something dark and threatening lurking at the edges of my consciousness. Robert was in jail, but Tyler was still out there, and Tyler had learned his lessons well from his father. The Mitchell family had friends and allies in this small town, people who might not believe the accusations against Robert, people who might see Mama and me as the real troublemakers. My fight for survival was just beginning, and I was starting it from a hospital bed with pneumonia that could still kill me if the treatments didn't work. But for the first time in months, I wasn't fighting alone. Mama was finally on my side, finally willing to see the truth and act on it. The question was whether that would be enough to protect us from what was coming next. The turning point came on a gray Saturday morning when I could finally breathe without the oxygen mask. Dr. Morrison stood at the foot of my bed with a cautious smile, the first genuinely positive expression I'd seen from him since my admission to the hospital a week earlier. "Your lungs are clearing up nicely, Aubrey," he said, consulting the chart in his hands. "The antibiotics have finally gotten ahead of the infection, and your oxygen levels have been stable for 24 hours. I think we can start talking about sending you home soon." Home. The word should have filled me with joy, but instead it created a knot of anxiety in my stomach. Where exactly was home now? Robert was still in jail awaiting trial, but our house on Maple Street was still his house, filled with his belongings and his presence even in his absence. Tyler had been staying with his aunt across town since Robert's arrest, but he'd made it clear through messages passed by mutual friends that he blamed Mama and me for destroying his family. Mama had been sleeping in a reclining chair next to my bed every night, leaving only to shower at home and grab clean clothes. The stress of the past week had aged her visibly, adding new lines around her eyes and gray streaks to her auburn hair. But there was also something different about her. Now, a steely determination that I'd never seen before. "We're not going back to that house," she told Dr. Morrison when he mentioned discharge plans. "I don't care if Robert is in jail. That place holds too many bad memories for Aubrey, and I won't subject her to living there again." Mrs. Patterson, who had become a regular fixture in my hospital room, nodded approvingly. "We've been working on alternative housing options," she said, pulling out her ever-present folder of documents. "There's a transitional housing program for families fleeing, domestic violence that has an opening. It's not luxurious, but it's safe and affordable while you get back on your feet." The transitional housing turned out to be a converted motel on the outskirts of Nashville, about an hour's drive from Riverside. Each family got their own small apartment with a kitchenette and basic furniture. It wasn't much, but as Mama said, when we first walked through the door, it was ours, and ours alone. The other families in the complex had their own stories of survival and escape. There was Maria, a young mother with twin toddlers who had fled her abusive husband in the middle of the night. Down the hall lived Sandra, an older woman whose adult son had been stealing her Social Security checks and threatening her when she tried to stop him. Each story was different, but we all shared the same shell-shocked expression of people who had escaped one nightmare only to find themselves facing an uncertain future. Starting over at 32 with an 11-year-old daughter and no job prospects would have broken some people, but Mama approached it with the same determination she'd shown when she decided to leave Robert. Within 2 weeks of my hospital discharge, she'd found work as a waitress at a truck stop diner near the highway. The pay was better than what she'd made in Riverside, and the tips from long-haul truckers helped supplement our meager savings. I enrolled in a new school, Jefferson Elementary, where nobody knew our story or our history. To my new classmates and teachers, I was just Aubrey Sky, a shy girl who had moved to Nashville with her mother for work reasons. The principal, Mrs. Coleman, had been briefed on our situation by Mrs. Patterson, but she kept that information confidential while making sure I had access to the school counselor whenever I needed it. The counselor, Mr. Rodriguez, was a kind man in his 40s who specialized in working with children who had experienced trauma. Unlike the therapy sessions I'd been forced into immediately after Robert's arrest, These conversations felt safe and helpful. Mr. Rodriguez didn't push me to talk about details I wasn't ready to share, but he taught me techniques for managing the anxiety and nightmares that still plagued me months after the assault. Healing wasn't a straight line. Some days I felt strong and optimistic about our new life. Other days, a stranger's voice in the grocery store or the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway would send me into a panic attack that left me shaking and unable to breathe properly. Mama learned to recognize the warning signs and developed her own strategies for helping me through these episodes. The legal proceedings against Robert dragged on for months. Because Riverside was in a different county from where we now lived, Mama had to take time off work to attend hearings and meetings with prosecutors. Each court appearance was a reminder of the trauma we were trying to move past, but Mama insisted it was important for justice to be served. Robert's lawyer tried every strategy imaginable to discredit our testimony. They suggested that I had made up the allegations to get attention. They claimed that the medical evidence could have been caused by my illness rather than sexual assault. They painted Mama as an unstable woman who had coached me to lie because she wanted to divorce Robert and needed grounds to justify leaving him. The prosecutor, a determined woman named Angela Murphy, methodically dismantled each of these arguments with medical evidence and expert testimony. She brought in a pediatric gynecologist who explained exactly how the injuries I'd sustained could only have been caused by forced sexual contact with an adult. She presented psychological evaluations that demonstrated the consistency and believability of my account of the abuse. Most importantly, she helped me understand that testifying wasn't just about seeking justice for what had happened to me. It was about protecting other children who might become Robert's victims if he wasn't held accountable for his crimes. The trial took place on a cold February day almost 8 months after Robert's arrest. Mama and I had to drive back to Riverside, back to the courthouse where Robert had once served on the volunteer fire department, and where everyone knew him as a pillar of the community. Walking into that building felt like stepping back into a nightmare I thought we'd escaped. Taking the witness stand was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my 12 years of life. Robert sat at the defense table in a clean suit and tie, looking nothing like the monster who had assaulted me in my own bedroom while I was dying from pneumonia. His eyes never left my face during my testimony, and I could feel the same predatory intensity I remembered from that horrible Monday afternoon. But I wasn't the same helpless, sick child I'd been then. Months of therapy and Mama's unwavering support had given me strength I didn't know I possessed. When the defense lawyer tried to confuse me with complicated questions about dates and times, I stayed calm and stuck to the truth of what I remembered. When he suggested that I might have been hallucinating due to my fever, I looked directly at the jury and said, "Sir, I know the difference between being sick and being hurt by someone. What Robert did to me was real, and it was wrong, and no amount of fever could make me imagine something that painful and that scary." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges. Robert was sentenced to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 8 years. It wasn't life in prison, but it was enough time for me to grow up, for our family to rebuild, for our wounds to begin healing. As the bailiff led Robert away in handcuffs, he turned back to look at Mama and me one final time. Even then, even after being convicted and sentenced, he had the audacity to mouth the words, "This isn't over," in our direction. But instead of feeling afraid, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year: complete and total freedom. Tyler, who had turned 18 during the trial proceedings, approached us in the courthouse hallway afterward. I expected anger or threats, but what I saw in his face was something more complicated. He looked older than his years, worn down by months of community gossip and the knowledge of what his father had done. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his words directed at me rather than Mama. I knew something was wrong, and I should have done something to stop it. I was just a kid, but that's not an excuse. His apology didn't erase the months of fear and the complicity in my suffering, but it was a start. Tyler left Riverside shortly after the trial, joining the military and cutting all ties with the community that had raised him. I never saw him again, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd gotten married and started a family of his own, determined to break the cycle of abuse that had defined his childhood. With the trial behind us, Mama and I could finally focus completely on building our new life. The transitional housing program had strict time limits, but Mama had saved enough money from her job at the truck stop to put a deposit on a small apartment in a better neighborhood. It was a 2-bedroom place with windows that faced east, filling our living room with morning sunlight that felt like a daily blessing. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that impressed my teachers and worried Mama. While other kids my age were discovering makeup and pop music, I was reading advanced books about psychology and medicine, determined to understand not just what had happened to me, but why it happened, and how to prevent it from happening to other children. Mrs. Coleman, my principal, noticed my academic focus and recommended me for a gifted and talented program that would allow me to take high school courses while still in middle school. The accelerated learning felt like a lifeline, a way to channel my intensity and trauma into something productive and hopeful. By the time I turned 13, I had a clear vision of my future that went far beyond just surviving what Robert had done to me. I wanted to become a doctor, specifically a pediatrician who specialized in recognizing and treating children who had experienced abuse. I wanted to be the kind of medical professional who would notice the signs that others missed, who would ask the right questions and know how to respond when children tried to tell their stories. Mama supported this dream even when it seemed impossibly ambitious for a girl from our background. She picked up extra shifts at the diner and took a second job cleaning offices on weekends to save money for my education. Every sacrifice she made was an investment in a future where my trauma could be transformed into purpose. The scholarship applications and college preparations started early. By my sophomore year of high school, I was taking advanced placement courses and volunteering at the local children's hospital. The doctors and nurses there treated me as a serious student rather than just a teenager doing community service. And I learned more about medicine and patient care in those volunteer hours than I could have from any textbook. One afternoon, while I was helping to organize patient files, I overheard a conversation between 2 nurses about a young patient who had been admitted with suspicious injuries. The child, a 7-year-old girl, had been brought in by her stepmother with a story that didn't quite match the evidence of her condition. Without thinking, I approached the nurses and shared what I'd learned about recognizing signs of abuse from my own experience and research. My insights helped them ask better questions, and ultimately led to the discovery that the child was being sexually abused by a family friend. The case was reported to authorities, and the child was placed in protective custody. That afternoon marked a turning point in my understanding of how my past could serve my future. I wasn't just studying to become a doctor for my own healing. I was preparing to be the kind of advocate and protector that I'd needed when I was 11 years old, and too sick to defend myself against a predator. The road ahead was still long and challenging. Medical school would require years of intense study and enormous financial resources that we didn't have. But for the first time since that horrible Monday afternoon in my childhood bedroom, I could see a clear path forward, a way to transform the worst experience of my life into a force for protecting other children. Mama and I had survived Robert's assault on our family. We had escaped his control and built a new life based on truth rather than the lies we'd been forced to live. Now it was time to make sure that our survival counted for something beyond just our own healing. The acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in March, delivered by a postal worker who had no idea he was carrying the key to everything I'd worked toward for the past 7 years. Mama was getting ready for her early shift at the diner when I tore open the envelope from Vanderbilt University School of Medicine with trembling hands. "Dear Miss Sky," I read aloud, my voice cracking with emotion. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into our Doctor of Medicine program beginning in the fall semester." Mama dropped her coffee mug, and neither of us cared about the ceramic pieces scattered across our kitchen floor. She wrapped me in a hug that lifted me off my feet, both of us crying tears of joy and disbelief. After years of 16-hour study, days, countless scholarship applications, and volunteer work that often left me exhausted, I was finally going to become a doctor. The financial aid package was generous enough to cover tuition and basic living expenses, a combination of merit-based scholarships and need-based grants that recognized both my academic achievements and our family's circumstances. For the first time since leaving Riverside, money wouldn't be the primary obstacle standing between me and my dreams. Medical school was everything I'd expected, and more. The coursework was rigorous beyond anything I'd experienced, requiring a level of dedication that pushed even my well-developed study habits to their limits. But every late night spent memorizing anatomical structures and every exhausting exam was fueled by the memory of that 7-year-old girl in the hospital whose abuse I'd helped uncover during my volunteer work. My fellow students came from privileged backgrounds that I could barely comprehend. They talked casually about parents who were surgeons and professors, about summer homes and European vacations and trust funds that would cushion any professional setbacks. I learned to navigate these conversations carefully, sharing enough about my background to fit in without revealing the full truth of where I'd come from. The pediatrics rotation in my 3rd year confirmed what I'd known since I was 13. Working with children felt natural and meaningful in ways that other specialties didn't. I had an intuitive understanding of how to communicate with young patients, how to recognize when their stories didn't quite add up, how to create an environment where they felt safe enough to share difficult truths. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the chief of pediatrics, noticed my aptitude early in the rotation. She was a formidable woman in her 50s who had built her career around advocating for children's rights and improving the medical system's response to abuse cases. "You have something special, Aubrey," she told me during one of our supervision meetings. "Most students struggle with the emotional aspects of pediatric abuse cases, but you seem to understand these children on a level that goes beyond textbook knowledge." I'd never told anyone at medical school about my own history, but Dr. Warren's perceptive comment made me wonder if my experiences showed in ways I didn't realize. There was something in the way abused children responded to me, a recognition that passed between us without words, that suggested they sensed I understood their pain from personal experience. During my final year of medical school, I decided it was time to share my story more openly. I wrote an essay for the Student Medical Journal about the intersection of personal trauma and professional calling, describing how my own experience as a survivor had shaped my approach to medicine. The response was overwhelming, with classmates and faculty members expressing admiration for my courage and insight. More importantly, the essay reached other survivors within the medical community. I began receiving letters from doctors, nurses, and medical students who had their own histories of abuse and were struggling to balance their personal healing with their professional responsibilities. Without intending to, I'd become a voice for a community that rarely spoke publicly about these connections. Residency applications were due in the fall of my 4th year, and I knew exactly where I wanted to specialize. The pediatric residency program at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia had a reputation for excellence in child abuse prevention and treatment. Their fellowship program in child protective services was considered the gold standard for training physicians to work with maltreated children. The interview process was intensive, requiring presentations on complex cases and detailed discussions of my research interests. When they asked about my motivation for choosing this specialty, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of giving the carefully rehearsed answer I'd prepared, I told them the truth about Robert, about my own abuse, and about how that experience had driven every academic and professional choice I'd made since I was 11 years old. The silence in the interview room after I finished speaking was deafening. I was certain I'd made a terrible mistake, that my honesty had disqualified me from consideration. Then Dr. Sarah Martinez, the residency director, leaned forward with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for sharing that with us," she said quietly. "What you've told us doesn't make us question your fitness for this program. It makes us understand why you're exactly the kind of physician these children need. The acceptance letter came 6 weeks later, along with an invitation to participate in their specialized track for physician advocates. It was a program designed for doctors who wanted to combine clinical practice with policy work and legal advocacy for abused children. Mama came to my medical school graduation, wearing a dress she'd saved up to buy for the occasion. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I could see her in the audience, crying and cheering loudly enough for the entire auditorium to hear. "Dr. Aubrey Sky," the announcer said, and for a moment I thought about that sick 11-year-old girl who had nearly died from pneumonia while being assaulted by her stepfather. That girl couldn't have imagined this moment, couldn't have conceived of a future where her pain would become her purpose. Residency was grueling in ways that medical school hadn't prepared me for. 36-hour shifts in the emergency department, complex cases that required split-second decisions, and the emotional weight of seeing children in crisis day after day. But I thrived in the intensity, finding strength in the knowledge that every difficult case was preparation for the work I was truly meant to do. My first major child abuse case as a resident involved a 9-year-old boy whose injuries were eerily similar to what I'd experienced with Robert. The child had been brought to the emergency department by his mother with a suspicious story about falling downstairs, but the pattern of bruises and the child's fearful behavior suggested something more sinister. Working with the hospital's child protective team, I was able to establish enough trust with the boy to help him disclose that his stepfather had been abusing him for months. The case went to trial, and I testified as both a treating physician and an expert witness on child abuse patterns. The stepfather was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. After the trial, the boy's mother approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Thank you for believing him," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for knowing the right questions to ask, and for making him feel safe enough to tell the truth." That moment crystallized everything I'd been working toward. This was why I'd endured years of intensive study, why I'd pushed through the trauma of my own past, why I'd chosen a specialty that forced me to confront the worst aspects of human behavior on a daily basis. I was the doctor I'd needed when I was 11 years old, the advocate who could recognize abuse even when it was carefully hidden, the voice that spoke for children who couldn't speak for themselves. The fellowship in Child Protective Services opened even more doors. I learned about the legal system from prosecutors and social workers, studied the latest research on trauma and recovery, and developed expertise in forensic interviewing techniques that could help children disclose abuse safely and effectively. My research focused on improving the medical response to child sexual abuse, particularly in cases where children presented with concurrent medical conditions that complicated diagnosis and treatment. I published papers on the intersection of physical illness and sexual trauma, drawing on my own experience to inform clinical practice guidelines. By the time I completed my fellowship, I had been offered positions at several prestigious children's hospitals, but I chose to return to Tennessee, accepting a position as the Director of Child Protection Services at Monroe Children's Hospital in Nashville. It felt like coming full circle, using my education and expertise to protect children in the same region where I'd once been a victim. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply rewarding. Every case was an opportunity to intervene in a child's life, to provide medical evidence that could lead to conviction of perpetrators, to connect families with resources for healing and recovery. I testified in dozens of trials, always thinking about Robert and how his conviction had been the first step in my own journey toward freedom. On weekends, I volunteered with a nonprofit organization that provided training for medical professionals on recognizing and responding to child abuse. My personal story became a powerful teaching tool, helping doctors and nurses understand the long-term impact of trauma and the importance of treating child victims with sensitivity and respect. Mama remained my strongest supporter throughout these years, attending every graduation and celebrating every professional milestone. She had returned to school herself, earning a degree in social work and finding meaningful employment helping other families navigate the aftermath of domestic violence. Our shared trauma had become the foundation for lives dedicated to protecting others from similar experiences. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in October, 25 years after Robert's conviction. It was the victim's advocate from the Tennessee Department of Corrections, calling to inform me that Robert had died in prison from complications related to lung cancer. He had served 18 years of his 15-year sentence due to additional charges filed after other victims came forward during his incarceration. I felt no satisfaction in his death, but there was a sense of closure in knowing that he would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. His passing marked the end of a chapter in my life that had defined my path but no longer controlled my daily thoughts or emotional well-being. Looking back now, at 72 years old, I can see how every terrible thing that happened to me as a child ultimately served a greater purpose. The trauma that nearly destroyed me became the driving force behind a career that protected hundreds of other children from similar fates. The illness that made me vulnerable to Robert's assault taught me empathy for patients facing their own health crises while dealing with additional trauma. My story isn't unique in its pain, but I hope it's unique in its transformation. Every survivor has the potential to turn their trauma into purpose, their suffering into strength, their victimization into advocacy. It's not an easy path, and it's not the right path for everyone, but for those of us called to this work, there's no greater honor than using our lived experience to protect the vulnerable. The little girl who nearly died from pneumonia while being assaulted by her stepfather grew up to become Dr. Aubrey Sky, child advocate and protector. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it required support from countless people along the way. But it proves that surviving is just the beginning. The real victory comes in what we do with that survival, how we use our second chances to create change in the world. To any survivor watching this who feels trapped by their trauma, who can't imagine a future beyond their pain, I want you to know that healing is possible. Purpose can emerge from the darkest experiences. Your story isn't over, and your trauma doesn't define your potential. You have the power to transform your pain into something that serves others, to ensure that your suffering wasn't in vain. That's the real miracle of survival. Not just living through the worst that humans can do to each other, but finding ways to make sure it doesn't happen to the next child, the next victim, the next family. We survive not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us, everyone we can protect with the wisdom we gained from our own darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.